Okay, let's move ahead so that we can use all our time together. Welcome everybody to our leadership series. I'm Ron Fry, the outgoing interim director of the MPOD program. One of the reasons I'm so happy today to welcome our incoming director, but we'll get to that introduction in just a second. It's a pleasure for David Cooperrider and I to kind of host this session. Obviously, to welcome back to our faculty a longtime friend, associate, co-author, co-worker, co-inventor. So most of you, I'm sure, have read something about Frank, but I'll just kind of give you a few headlines to start with. So Frank Barrett is joining our Department of Organizational Behavior here on the faculty. He's most recently coming to us from the Naval Postgraduate School, where he has been for most of his academic career. He has been the chair of their department out there in management and organizational behavior. He set up a Center for Positive Change, from which he led about a dozen appreciative inquiry summits in 8 or 9 different commands over several years with the Navy. Frank is a graduate from Notre Dame University, and believe it or not, he's just completing his doctorate in theology from the Divinity School at Harvard, among other things that he does. Most of you are aware that before his academic career, when he joined our department as a doctoral student, Frank was an accomplished jazz pianist. He toured with the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra, among others. And he took that experience to create his most recent book, Say Yes to the Mess: Surprising Leadership Lessons from Jazz. And a lot of you here on the session, I think, are familiar with that aspect of Frank's life and what he brings to many, many different kinds of audiences and contexts. So we are, as I said, all of us in the Department of Organization Behavior, particularly at the Weatherhead School, are really excited to welcome Frank back to join primarily in our MPOD program from a teaching and instructor perspective, and then also obviously to join with us and us with him in his scholarly research interests, which I'm sure he's going to share a little bit about. We thought we'd go about this in a little bit different way. Instead of just turning it over to Frank for some kind of a presentation, we've invited David Cooperrider along to kind of join in a conversation or a quasi interview with Frank to at least get us started. And then once that gets going, I'm sure we'll make time for other people to bring questions or thoughts and welcomes to Frank as well. David, as most everyone knows, also a professor of organizational behavior here at the Weatherhead School. He is the Chuck and Char Fowler Professor of Business for World Benefit. And as all of us know, the thought leader in the creation and development of appreciative inquiry. So David, also thank you for coming and joining. And I think I'll turn it over to you to kind of get it started in a conversation with Frank.
Yeah. Well, and thank you, Ron, and let me share my excitement as well and my joy. I just at a personal level, I'll just share that I remember when my first son was born, Daniel, and Ron's wife, Maureen, was the midwife, and Frank was the first person outside of our family to see little Daniel. And
hold him. I held him.
You held him, yeah.
He was just a couple hours old.
You were the first person outside of the family
I
to.
drove your mom there to the hospital. I remember that.
Yep. Her plane was a little delayed.
Yeah.
So, part of the thrill for me is just what a talent Frank is, and what he brings to the field of OD and to the leadership of MPOD as we enter this inflection point in our world. It's just incredible. I had a great privilege of writing a letter of recommendation for Frank for this year for that position. And it was interesting as we discussed what he's still working on his next degree, his master's degree in divinity at Harvard and so on. But I just wanted to share a couple excerpts from what I wrote and thought about there. I said, it's a great privilege to recommend Professor Frank Barrett for the faculty director of MPOD. As can be seen in his resume, Frank has excelled in some of the finest learning environments in the world. And again, at the time I was writing, he's in the Harvard Divinity School. And for Frank Barrett, learning is not a pause between other activities or roles. It's his vocation. Whether he's reading Heidegger or Kierkegaard or Hannah Arendt or Peter Drucker, Frank is always engaged in what Alfred North Whitehead called the adventure of ideas. For example, as Ron mentioned, his recent book, Yes to the Mess, Surprising Leadership Lessons from Jazz. And I said I could go on in terms of his more than 65 publications and books and book chapters and so on. And but at the end, I just said, we could look at his syllabus or his vita for all of that. But I said, at the end, but let me end with this. It's about Frank Barrett as a human being. Frank is a joy to work with. He's a collaborator, a community builder, a co-creator. He lives a spirit of inquiry that seeks and sees potentials everywhere. His curiosity velocity is alluring and infectious, and people are elevated and love being around Frank. And in terms of character strength, Frank has a love for humanity, lives his life with courage and wisdom, a sense of beauty, and a search for betterment for all. So, we are overjoyed. We're filled with gratitude and looking forward to a next generation of leadership in our MPOD program and leadership in the field in this area. So let me just ask right off, Frank, why and what called you? Frank got his bachelor's degree in international relations, then a master's degree in literature, then a PhD in organizational behavior, then another master's degree in divinity. What is it, Frank, that calls you here, that inspires you most about coming to lead our OD program and shape the field?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that great introduction, Coop. It's very, very humbling, and reminds me that one of the big reasons I'm drawn to come here is to work with you and Ron. You guys have been two of my closest friends now for 40 years. So to see our friendship continue and grow is a big, big plus for me. So thank you. I think we're at a tipping point in the field. This is a tipping point right now. I don't think there's ever been a more exciting time to be alive than there is right now. The values that started this field back in the 1960s, the field really got started as a corrective. It was a corrective to the dehumanizing effects of bureaucracy, and articulated by many. Chris Argyros comes to mind. In the early 1950s, his book even said that we start to treat people in organizations the same way we treat subjects in experiments. We manipulate things and then watch what they do, and then we're surprised when they start to when they refuse to comply. The field started to correct those dehumanizing effects of bureaucracy, to make it more human, to create empowerment, to create participation. And a lot of that has taken hold. In a certain way, the world has changed dramatically, partially due to the input of the field of organizational development. So many of the things our forefathers and foremothers articulated and fought for have come true. Organizations have become more distributed. Participation is higher. We hear people talk openly about engaging their heart and full commitments. So a lot of that has happened. But now I think we're at another tipping point. So I could say more about that, but I think we're at another tipping point, and it has to do with the technocratic mindset. And I think we need to correct that. We still are a field of correctives to remind us of our full humanity. And in a way, we're victims of success. Organizations now use team building all the time. Managers who've never heard of the field of organizational development are using the tools of organizational development. So our wisdom is spread out. That's great, but it's time for renewal. That's what draws me here.
Yeah. And, earlier in conversations, you did talk about some of the trends and so on, and what you see on the horizon for the field. Where do you see, what do you see as those macro, the big trends or opportunities or uncertainties that we're into? Yeah.
Well, I think it's funny when you think about the way the field got started. There's a debate. Did it start at MIT or did it start at Case? There was an argument, there wasn't really, it was a very friendly argument. But, Herb Shepard, and it was called the Case Institute of Technology. It wasn't Case Western Reserve. And MIT was the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It's no accident that the field of OD got started in technological institutes. Herb Shepard here, Dick Beckhardt at MIT. And as I said, to correct the dehumanizing effects of bureaucracy. So now we have distributed leadership. Now we have loosely coupled systems, just like we fought for. And we now have bottoms up management programs. So now I think the challenge is, now that participation has gotten loose, now the challenge is coordination. And without just bureaucracy. Bureaucracy worked well to coordinate from the top down, but now from the bottom up, how do we integrate better? I call it in Yes to the Mess, I call it minimal structure, maximal autonomy, but that means we need a coordinating device. And some version of a minimal structure that's going to allow people to update each other as they go in their autonomous ways. Regular updating, at the minimal regular updating, if not heart-to-heart connections. I think that's one of the things that's needed.
Okay, let's build on this, Frank, because it was interesting. I was thinking about the Academy Award-winning movie this year, and how the title just kind of captured a zeitgeist. Everything, everywhere, changing all at once. We could add to that everyone, everywhere, and I think of everything that we've been through since the start of the 20s. Just massive mega floods and mega fires, just ongoing, the global pandemic and all the shifts in the workplaces and the inflection points, and how the future of work is just such an unknown at this point. The changes, like George Floyd, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, and the call for racial, justice and equity and inclusion, and then obviously all the climate change issues on top of the threats to democracy, and the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what that means for the world. And I think back to Peter Drucker's notion when he talked about us being now a society of organizations.
Yep.
You know, just how important our field is in this era of perpetual disruption. So, you know, can you speak to your newest book on, you know, a little bit around, you know, how can organizations cope and with this complexity and constant disruption and so on? You know, you share how the best leaders improvise and so on,
Yep.
but can you go into a little bit about the metaphor of jazz and its meaning in today's world?
Yeah, thank you. Again, I think if we go back to the founding of our field, Kurt Lewin in the 1940s, going in the 50s, his famous 3 stages of change, and it seems like every model of change gets re-articulated every 5 years, and it's all in 3 stages. The titles are the change, but the story is the same. You know, the idea we unfreeze, and then we introduce change, and we refreeze. Well, that's an assumption that change is unusual. That's an assumption that change is infrequent, that it's discontinuous, that life is inertial, and then introduce change and then refreeze to the old system. I think that model, that vocabulary doesn't work anymore. I think change is now continuous. It's constant, it's evolving, it's cumulative, and with endless modifications. And planning is still important, but you know, planning is of minimal help when it comes to predicting, because the unpredictable is predictable. So the perspective needs to be more local, and instead of, you know, what is it, unfreezing, change, refreezing, since it's in continuous flow. I think what we need is a rhythm of temporary freeze, and then a reorientation, and then unfreezing again. You know, haven't quite got the language that I want yet for that rhythm, but you know, it's the language of improvisation, of making up as we go along, and sense making together. Sense making is now continual; it's not occasional, and so it means paying attention to emergent patterns. We need a vocabulary that notices emergent patterns. I think we also need to loosen ourselves from the vocabulary of individuality, individual autonomy, individual freedom, human rights. The rights discourse has really taken over. And again, that was an important corrective. But in a way, it's been too much. We need a language of relational responsibility and relational generativity. You know, I think I mentioned earlier, we're still a field that is a corrective to the world. And I mentioned the technocratic mindset that I think has resulted in, you know, planetary injustice to the planet itself, not just to relationships. There's all this excitement about technological breakthroughs, and which is very exciting. I mean, even the New York Times today is talking about autonomous cars. Every day, front page New York Times, there's something about technological breakthroughs. You know, the new chat, the new functions of AI, artificial intelligence. And there's this fear that machines are going to take over. You know, machines are going to be thinking, machines will become more and more human. But I think the danger is in the other direction. I think there's a danger that humans are becoming more machine-like. Mm-hmm. You know, trying to become more predictable, trying to remove themselves from the chaos of human feeling. And I mean, sometimes even if you just call a help center, you could hear the person on the other end going through a decision tree like a machine. If they say yes, then we say this option. If you say no, then we say this option. I think there's a danger, if we don't pay attention, we'll try and shape ourselves to be more and more like machines, like artificial intelligence. And that's the corrective we need to apply. I think our field's called to.
Yeah. So take us through then, you know, some of the ways you've helped companies, or maybe the journey into large scale transformation with the Navy. But how do you bring this improvisational mindset? And, what were some of your lessons as you worked with the Navy and helped set up that center? What are, if you can take us through a bit of the journey into large scale transformation and the way you bring the improvisational mindset, unlearning, learning, all that stuff.
Yeah, I think it's right. It's funny, because the improvisation metaphor works for small groups like jazz bands, but it also works at the large system setting. You and I have done the work in appreciative inquiry summits, and Ron, we've done work in appreciative inquiry summits. It also works at the level of larger scale. I think what it does is introduce the vocabulary of designing over decision making. When we think about taking action in organizations, and the way management was taught for several years is you do a rational analysis, you say sort of detached, you minimize risk, find the predetermined alternatives and select the best ones and be good problem solvers. That sort of way of being, that machine-like way of being that's been extolled for years, doesn't work in the age of continuous change. We need to become active experimenters. And I think some of the design thinking movement is tapping into that the way to move forward is to immerse yourself and engage yourself in active experimentation. What's the language from design thinking? I think it's rapid prototyping. What it means is we need to stoke our, I call it as if imaginations, to be able to articulate an anticipatory world that doesn't exist yet, but enrich it with as much detail as possible, even if it exists nowhere in reality. So people can step into an imagined world, and then retrospect, it becomes real with micro moves. It's what do we learn while engaged in full experimentation? Which means, as you mentioned earlier, learning is ongoing. It's not a timeout. So instead of, managers' identities linked to images of control or accomplishment or prediction, really our identities should be linked to images of experimentation. Act first and discover later, discover as we go. We do that in the summits, as you know, at the appreciative inquiry summits. We have a whole day designed to just dreaming, imagining what are some initial actions we can take. And the reason the jazz metaphor works is the jazz musicians live in a high velocity environment where there's lots of information going by, but your job is to not do what you did before. You particularly can't rely on your past success. You have to try something new. You have to be present in the moment and experiment with something new just to see where it goes, in a context where everybody is doing that, not just you, with no guarantee it's the right thing to do, but you do it and it's in public. So problem solving is of limited value. In jazz, you can't say, geez, I want to go back 2 measures and play that again. That's not going to work. It's how we're learning in real time as we leap into an unknown future with all the excitement and all the trepidation it offers. So that's one of the reasons I think jazz is a useful metaphor. It provides us with a good vocabulary for what's needed. That's my initial thoughts.
Yeah.
I'm improvising all these answers.
And I loved it. Like when we did it with Admiral Clark at the Navy one, how you did a whole session on jazz as we shifted into the design and delivery destiny phases. And how, in this command and control system, how they just loved it and started moving into just incredible creativity, like how a young sailor could be out at sea for years and not see their young daughter growing up, but then how they can create a virtual reading space and library where, they could say, hop on the sofa next to me and we'll read a story about the, the light in the world or whatever. Anyway, yeah, the joyful.
So you and I remember we were at that summit in 2001 when they were imagining possible futures. And
Right.
when they proposed these ideas, the audience laughed. Everybody laughed.
Oh, yeah.
And all of those things have come true.
Yeah.
So one of them was exactly like you said. He imagined he was on a ship.
And a virtual reality.
Virtual reality. He has his daughters in front of him. His wife is in front of him. He's telling her how beautiful his wife looks. And everybody laughed at that. Well, that turns out that's become true. Or the one time they imagined they're at sea, they're in the Gulf, and while they're there, they're working on a master's degree, and everybody laughed at that. Well, that's happening now. And that's because, what we did, we helped them do. I mean, they did the work. You and I were just sort of facilitators, is to create this imagined space, this what I called as if imagination. Act as if the world were the way you most want it to be. So let's articulate those nascent images as much as possible and flesh them out with detail, the way a poet would flesh out a vision, or the way a novelist would create a whole world. Let's talk about that world in some detail. And then lo and behold, within a few years, it becomes true.
Yeah. So let's have you think through a little bit. Well, maybe it's just where your excitement in terms of research is right now, but also some of the, if we were speaking to the, younger generation of people in OD, and we certainly are doing that in the program, but with that mindset, what are some of the research topics and research directions that you are interested in, first of all, but you think that represents where the field should be studying? I can remember when Dave Brown and Friedlander wrote an article and saying, action research, as a core of the field, is about combining education, training and education and change, and contributing to next generation theory and knowledge. But they argued that not much new knowledge is coming out of the field. We get so enamored with action and the education part of it. But just as I'd love to hear your thoughts on what are some of the exciting topic areas that you feel we're being called to study now.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, a bunch of things come to mind. And one of them is this, what we're talking about right now. I would like to know more about how people are learning when they're thrown in over their heads. Like, what is the experience of learning in the midst of novelty when, going through first initial experience of feeling overwhelmed and helpless? That's going to happen. But people work through that. What are the stages they go through that allow them to continue to learn when in a situation they did not choose, but they have to make something happen and they have to take action? I want to know more about that. I mean, I've started a little research project on that. It's related to my notion of provocative competence from the Yes to the Mess book. These are great leaders know how to provoke individuals and groups and organizations just the right amount to throw people in over their heads, so that they have to draw on different ways of being, that the old routines are inadequate. And I want to study leaders that allow that to happen. And then what's the phenomenology of those undergoing that? And my instinct is, for leaders, it means really having a double vision, like seeing someone's potential better than they see themselves. You might my story about Miles Davis, how Miles could do that with his musicians. But I see that in great leaders too. You mentioned Admiral Clark. Admiral Clark did that with several of his people. He'd throw them in, he'd put them on the spot, put them into situations for which on paper it looks like they weren't ready. but they had to grow into a new call. So I think leaders have that double vision, and they also give you a chance to try again and try again, because you're never going to get it right the first time. So they stay present. I like the way that Bob Keegan in his book, The Evolving Self, says great leaders should be like what mothers do with little kids. You hold on, you let go, and you stay in place all at the same time. I love that tripartite structure. Hold on, let go, and stay in place while the organization is learning, while some of your members are floundering, while they're in real time making sense of things,
Right.
and give them a chance to go at it over and over again. So
Wow.
that's my first thought anyway.
Yeah.
I'm improvising all these answers, Cooper.
Well, it's wonderful. And I want to, in a little bit, I'll invite others to come in with questions, comments, continuing conversations, and so on. So,
Dave, can I bring one in?
Yeah.
Frank, I know, and I'm sure David does too, that this kind of but most recent part of your lifelong learning was very intentional. This interest in theology and wanting to pursue this doctorate at the Harvard Divinity School. And my question is, how is that experience, all the learning that's related in that experience, how is that shaping some of these images you have about turning points and correction and what we need to focus on in the future?
Wow. Yeah. Thanks for asking. I should have a ready-made answer for that, because it's pretty central to what I'm doing.
I'll stay put.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Hold on, let go, and stay in place. Thank you. Well, it's been incredibly rich, obviously, to be, and especially one of the things is to be around people who are a lot younger than me with all this energy and optimism in the face of a planet that's going crazy. I'd say in general, what it's given me is a real appreciation for why it's important that all of us have a sense of high purpose outside of ourselves. That sounds like a cliche, but I think it really comes true to me more and more. The thing about theology is they don't deny human brokenness. Theologians do not deny that humans are broken. The vocabulary changes, depends what faith tradition you're in. Hindus and Buddhists don't call it sin. Christians tend to call it sin. It doesn't matter what vocabulary you have, but they all address there's a brokenness, and the healing has something to do with a yes. The word yes keeps coming up in my life, doesn't it? A yes to something larger, a higher purpose that pulls you outside of your brokenness into something bigger and better. Our Jewish forefathers and foremothers, I keep going back to the Hebrew Bible, and as the older I get, the more I go back, that there's always an offer of a new covenant. There's always another offer for a new way of being in the world that's more generative and richer. The brokenness does not win and does not have the final say. And the way I see it enacted at Harvard is all the energy around the environment and ecology. There's so much energy around that right now, and also energy around race and racial divisions. But there's a spirit of, I don't want to use the word optimism. It's more activism. That is just contagious. It's starting to unify a lot of sub-communities especially around the planet and around race. So it gives me hope. It gives me hope. That's probably the biggest gift it's given me in my life. So
Awesome. Yeah, I'm wondering right now, for OD? What is the purpose of OD? What's its normative vision in a world like this? Like, you know, you talk about the young people and so on, and you talk about the, this. I mean, we are in a mission moment. You talk about purpose. The economist Mariana Mazzucato has studied economies that are most dynamic, and it's when they have a purpose. It's like the metaphor. She studied 100 different countries where they had something like the Kennedy moonshot moment. That's impossible. It's almost science fiction, but it's a purpose that can call people together. And I think about, the headlines the other day, where the planet is, the warmest it's been in thousands and thousands of years. And we're nowhere near on track to realize the Paris Agreement at one point, building a whole economy, like Larry Fink talks about at BlackRock, a fundamental reshaping of that field of finance. Well, we're in a stage where every industry, if we're going to have any kind of chance in a decade and, by 2050, around a lot of these issues, every industry has to go through massive transformation, every company and so on. So what is your sense of what's the purpose of OD? Could it be that this is the moment that OD actually grows into its higher purpose?
God, boy, I'm on board with you right away. I think that sounds exactly like the right and important thing to do. And as you were speaking, I'll just go back to address something Ron mentioned. One of the other things I'm learning at Harvard Divinity School is the holiness of grief. We can't pretend like things aren't bad. And anybody who takes appreciative inquiry to mean that we should avoid brokenness and bad things has not understood what we want from appreciative inquiry. Grief is real, and expressing grief is a sacred thing. Partially because it's expression of love. And when you love somebody, eventually that person's going to die. Eventually things are going to end. Grief is the first cousin of love. And so we shouldn't avoid chances to go through that, to say, look at what's happening in the planet. Things aren't looking good. And out of grief comes a new wholeness. That's why I say grief can be a holy expression. And often the new wholeness has to do with the higher purpose. Something much bigger and probably beyond our current vocabulary.
Yeah.
I just know that it's a vocabulary of relating. It's not a vocabulary of libertarian autonomy. Yeah. No, that's good. And have people just chime in. Are there some emerging thoughts or questions or things you might want to underscore? I think you could raise your hand or just unmute, and let's take. As you're looking for somebody, let me just take 2 minutes and remind people we're still accepting applications for the MPOD program. And anybody who decide based on this podcast wants to apply, we're offering a $5,000 scholarship. So please,
in Frank's name,
in my name.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So if this is taped and somebody's listening to it 5 years from now, it doesn't count. But anyway, if you we're still accepting applicants. We're excited about the new class. Go ahead, Coop.
Yeah. Let me just invite some open conversation here.
Hey, Andy raised his hand. You want to say something, Andy? Coop, I'll let you call on people.
Help me.
Okay.
Yeah, Andrew, go ahead.
Hey, thanks. So it's good to see you, Frank.
Andy, good to see you, Dr. Gordon.
So I really appreciate what you're saying about throwing people in the deep end and seeing what they're capable of beyond what they might be able to conceive themselves. But when you mentioned that, I was like, wait, that was my area of study, is what happens when you're in the middle of fear. What can you do?
Yep.
In the middle of that state? And I just took a note that something that you're not talking about, that you haven't said, but it's like making the choice to not be defensive,
Right.
in the face of all these challenges.
Right. That's right.
And when we move beyond defensiveness, then we're not caught up in denying what's present.
Andy wrote a great dissertation at Benedictine University on leaders in working through fear. And he just made some reference to it. And one of the crucial steps is, and again, I think this is something we need to study more, like Andy started to do, is often when you're thrown in with fear, the first thought is to get self-protective. So the question is, what creates openness in this state of when you're feeling threatened? What leads to a sense of openness and vulnerability, which is needed to be a learner? That's a great question.
Rick, just unmute.
Yes. Yeah, I love this, by the way. It's just really a sacred moment. Thank you. I recall a comment I learned a couple years ago about, it was in a talk on biases, that there's biases everyone has. And one of the biases was that our brains prefer a simple lie over a complex truth. And I was thinking about what you were said when people are overwhelmed and realizing they have to reconcile, well, I've always thought this, but now this is new and different. And then someone makes up a lie about it to make it simple, and they avoid, in a sense, the deeper wrestling with something to take them to a better place. And I just wondered if you want to comment on any observation about that notion that our brains literally are wired to prefer a simple lie over a complex truth.
I don't know neurology well enough to speak how our brains are wired. I do know that in this again, if you're in a state of fear or overwhelm, you'll go for security and sometimes simple lies or securities. And this has been the truth throughout history. This isn't new. In the Hebrew Bible, there was the danger of false prophets. False prophets show up at times of chaos. It's predictable. And, we also have long-term visionary prophets that we need. So, yeah, I think that's true. We have to be mindful of that.
And Sarah, you were mentioning that there's some parallels here with Nadia's reinvention concepts and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Nadia's, and she does speak to the idea of just try things, just do it, learn from the experience, plunge in, and don't worry about planning for perfection. You learn a lot more by learning from the results of experiments.
Yeah.
So I think that aligns a lot with what you were saying, Frank. And maybe, part of OD's success in the future is more of a just try something mentality, that we as practitioners in the midst of things often, we're trying to plan and design, and maybe we shouldn't be planning and designing. We should be in the moment, listening deeply and reacting and joining in partnership with our clients rather than trying to be the guru. Is let's hold hands and see if we can figure this out together.
Yeah, and learning while engaged in experimentation is important. So it means there's ongoing sense making. Pay attention to the way people retrospectively make sense of a thing which they had not predicted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I also put a note in the chat that I do think when we throw people in to the deep end without any support, we get what we invested, which is not much. We have to figure out a way to be in the deep end with them when they start going, I can't swim. Where we have some ways to support them and get them out of trouble.
Yep.
Good. Yeah. Others?
Jane.
Frank, hi. This is
Hi,
Jane
Jane.
Day.
Hi,
I
Jane.
have the great privilege of being studying with David and Ron. They're on my doctoral committee and they've guided me this whole way along. I'm in my last year of the PhD at Case.
Oh, congratulations. You got the A team.
Oh my gosh, I have the dream team. Your work is resonating so much with me and with the work that I've been doing. And I have data that with these quotes, these rich quotes from leaders talking about, the fear was just debilitating, but I knew I had to show up. And that was that moment I could make the breakthrough. And, countless quotes of sharing their stories of vulnerability. When I ask, tell me about your greatest moment as a leader. And they talk about mistakes that they make and inadequacies that they face and showing up for their people anyway. And David recently turned me on to the progress principle, which is resonating really deeply, that like our makeup is that we need to progress. We are working towards that wholeness that you're talking about. And it comes not just through positive things. I think it mostly comes through the struggle, through the challenge. I loved what you said about grief. Grief is love, and from it comes greater wholeness. And if you're open, we need to keep talking, because
Sure.
I feel like I have data that supports your work, and I would love to share with you however I can help you. And my whole foundation of this whole, how can I help leaders do good better and become, it's a process of who are we becoming, and the process is, I think, is the whole key of all of it anyway.
Yeah.
But I have this kind of spiritual foundational document translating the spiritual concepts into business concepts. And so I can talk about it, in ways that can reach business leaders. But all of this is deeply spiritual, really, this whole journey.
Totally.
And I just want to thank you so much for being here and traveling the path that you have, and
Thank you.
investing to become this person who can talk at all of these, like, just really open it all up to us. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jane. Look forward to meeting you in person. And
I'm
check out Andy Gordon's dissertation on fear and leadership.
Excellent. I will. Thank you.
And Barbara from Stellenbosch University in South Africa, she's saying in their chat that the session is such a treat. And Barbara, can you share a little bit from South Africa, your thoughts on some of these conversations, the call of our times, to some of the ideas that we're all going to be called beyond our capabilities. So can I invite you to just share a little bit?
Sure. Thank you, David. So I don't know if I can speak for South Africa, but I can share experiences from attending an Ubuntu Fest in Portugal. And there were 500 people of all ages celebrating Ubuntu and talking about what it means to be relational. So, Frank, many of the themes that you spoke to resonate with me deeply and resonate with needs that I certainly see. And what can I say? It's just an absolute joy to be here. And South Africa is struggling right now. We're struggling with our own pathologies of democracies. But yet, in our everyday world, there's a lot of innovation, there's a lot of resilience in this country. I'm not all that familiar with the OD space here, but just the general overarching themes, Frank, make a lot of sense as I look at our world and what's happening in our world. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you.
David.
Great to hear from you.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah.
Got a hand from Oliver in Belgium.
Thank you. My name is Olivier from Brussels, and I'm really grateful to attend your session. Thank you, Frank, David, and all the team. So I don't have any question, but I was having a thought. It was really resonating with me because I'm a jazz enthusiast. I attended probably more than 100 sessions in the past. and I would pay 10 the price to attend again Toots Tillman's concert. He passed away 7 years ago. And so I was thinking each jazz session is unique, and I will always remember in my heart and in my mind these moments. So I think as long as we are expressing from the heart, that all that matter, we do the best we can, and each session is unique. So I will always remember, by instance, the performance of artists around Toots Tillmans. And so thank you for sharing also your thoughts about the messiness. I'm reclaiming my messiness and to thrive with that with each other. Thank you.
Thank you. And Toots Thielman was an amazing harmonica player. No one thought harmonica could become a jazz instrument. But check out his recordings. He's incredible. He's from Belgium. Just passed away, as you said, a few years ago. I saw him in concert several times. He's amazing.
Awesome.
You know what? It reminds me of one thing. It's just something I think Barbara said that triggered something in my. There is all this innovation happening. Innovation is a big topic and a big word and particularly around Silicon Valley, particularly technological innovation. But studies are coming out that now in Silicon Valley, the demand for psychotherapy has grown exponentially. People are hungry for human connection. And there's even a movement called cuddle movement in Silicon Valley, because so many therapists are overbooked that you can go to this website, I think it's called cuddlist.com, and pay somebody for an hour to come and cuddle with you. That speaks to a hunger. That speaks to something that's going on in the world where there's technological breakthrough and innovation, and not attending to the importance of relational meaning making. And that's one of the ways we're called, that this field is called.
Well, others, yeah. Yeah, I see that Susan is saying that we must innovate for a higher purpose and not just anything. And I think your relational, could this be the age of reunion? And that I think also means reunion in a biological sense with all of life. And is there a stage where we can lift up the voice of nature in our planning and the future generations, and to really stretch that relational kind of view? Because and then the bigger question I have for you is around acceleration. I think that's just huge. Last year I was at UNITAR with Nikhil Seth, the head of UNITAR, the research arm and training arm of the United Nations. And he was just absolutely so clear that we've been sleepwalking for, the last 4 decades. We're likely to pass the Paris Agreement's temperature goals and climate reduction, within a year or two, as opposed to 2050. And so his whole question was around acceleration. Are there lessons that we have in jazz and so on? Like, can we have a world jazz moment where, anyway, the whole question of acceleration and the larger purpose of OD.
That's an interesting question, isn't it?
The acceleration. And I guess it has to do with this magnitude of it. As a human family, we've done some pretty remarkable things, like the global eradication of smallpox or the rebuilding of Europe. But Marshall Plan and post-World War Reconstruction and so on. But nothing compares. All those things pale in significance to the mission moment of change. And it just feels like OD should really be at the heart of it.
Totally agree. I think one thing I'm beginning to appreciate more, I think others have too, is the power of a large group gathering, even if it's only for a short time.
Yeah.
Because the contagion afterwards becomes exponential, right? So you get a large group together for a conversation, even for a little bit, and it starts to explode. Look at the Me Too movement.
Yeah.
And no one predicted how quickly that was just going to take off. And
Right.
one or two moments, those are rich moments. They have a high potential.
Yeah. Cool.
We're nearing the end of the hour, and I just want to take a moment to appreciate everybody who's in the gallery here. I see longtime friends, I see alums, I see people I've never met, but the conversation going on in the chat has been rich, and just want to recognize and thank everybody for joining us. If you got to us, you have the schedule of the remaining year, our Thought Leader series. So we obviously encourage you to stay with us and keep coming into these sessions. David, thank you for always your generative questions. And Frank, welcome again.
Thank you. Great
Wholeheartedly.
To be back with. Thank you
We're
so
so
much.
happy to have you here on board with us.
Thanks,
I want to respect people's time and kind of draw this to a close, but thank you, David. Thank you, Frank. And thanks everybody else for
thank you, everybody. Thanks,
participating
Pat.
And coming in.
Thank you, Pat.
Just a special shout out to Ada Joe and Marcia and Adrian.
Oh my gosh. So many.
This is taking me back to journeys that began a long time ago.
Long time ago. Great to see all of you.